With only one game left of the 2024-25 college football season, I wanted to put out some rankings for the Power Four, but in these rankings, we're going to do tier rankings, putting each group of teams into different tiers, and I came up with 8 tiers. And this was actually pretty easy. There were some teams that I had, some debate trying to figure out where exactly they should fall. But it actually wasn't that hard putting these tiers together, especially at the top and at the bottom. So we're looking at how good these teams were. We're not looking at resumes or what they accomplished, just how good these teams were. And we're putting an emphasis on the end of the season. So we're looking at how they finished. Now, that doesn't mean we're ignoring the early part of the season. We're not ignoring it, but there is just a little bit more emphasis on the end of the season. And we'll talk about some teams that kind of got better and increased, moved up in these tiers later in the season. So yeah, just talking about the Power 4 teams, again, the 8 tiers, and we will be working off of these tiers when we do our projected records for next year, which is going to be starting very soon. I'll talk more about that later, but we're going to move teams up or down one tier if we think they're definitely going to be better or worse, or they'll stay in the same tier. You're not going to be able to move more than one tier. So that's how that works. Again, I'll explain it more later. But let's get into it here. We'll start with our top tier. Georgia, Penn State, Texas, Notre Dame, Oregon, and Ohio State. And we're looking at, I try to find clusters of games, games where multiple teams played each other evenly, things like that. And just, again, how these teams finished the season when I did these rankings. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of debate, and you guys are free to comment and let me know what you agree or disagree with. But I feel like this is a pretty easy tier. Again, Ohio State, the way they finished, they look like the best team in the country. Notre Dame made their way to the national championship. Penn State played Notre Dame tough. They played Ohio State tough, so we know that they're pretty similar. Oregon beat Ohio State, lost to Ohio State, beat Penn State. I mean, they're right there in this tier. Georgia and Texas, Texas doing what they did against Ohio State and playing them tough. I think, honestly, Georgia and Texas are a little bit below these other 4 teams, but it's not enough to put them in a separate tier. So I am going to put them into tier 1. But again, I do believe that Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, and Notre Dame are all a little bit better than Georgia and Texas. And then you also have to look at the Carson Beck injury for Georgia. How well will they have played against Notre Dame if Carson Beck had been in there? There are obviously lots of ways you can look at this. And I know some people are going to point out one thing and say, how can you do this when this team did this or that team did that? You have to look at all of the factors. I mean, there's so many things to look at. I'm sure there are plenty of arguments, again, that you guys can make to change some of these tiers around. But when you look at it, I do think that these 6 teams are pretty clear in tier 1. And then we go to tier number 2. Arizona State obviously played Texas really, really close. They blew out a good Iowa State team. Tennessee, are they really in this tier? It's hard to say because we don't have a huge sample size with Tennessee. They're definitely, behind Georgia. And I think they're definitely behind Ohio State. Could they possibly even be a tier 3 team? Again, it's hard to say. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on all these teams or this video will be way too long. Indiana, you look at the teams that they lost to, the 2 teams in the national championship, and the way they won the games that they won so easily, I think Indiana does deserve to be in the 2nd tier. And then Ole Miss, and I think this is one where people are going to probably push back on. Look, Ole Miss's losses were all 3 of them were on the last play. I know they lost to some teams that weren't great teams, but we also saw a side of them, when they beat Georgia and some of the games where they played, they looked really, really good. I think Ole Miss did enough, and the bowl game, I know it wasn't against a great team, but it was enough for me to push them into tier 2. And I believe, that cluster of teams, Ole Miss, Alabama, and South Carolina, I do believe pretty confidently that if those teams played each other, Ole Miss would beat both South Carolina and Alabama. So that's how I feel about that. Again, you could maybe disagree with that. And I would at least understand if some of you maybe wanted to put Ole Miss into a lower tier, but I personally do think that they deserve to be right here in tier number 2. All right, let's go to tier 3. Now we're starting to get more teams. We got Miami, Florida, Alabama, BYU, South Carolina, Iowa State, Illinois, Clemson, SMU, and Michigan. Miami, I mean, we saw it in the bowl game against Iowa State. They're pretty even with Iowa State, so I felt like they deserve to be in the same tier. SMU and BYU played a close game, pretty similar resumes. Again, you can kind of see how these teams could be grouped together. Same thing with Clemson and SMU, very even teams. Michigan, Alabama. Michigan beat Alabama. I don't think you can have Alabama in a tier above Michigan. South Carolina, Illinois played a close game. Florida, one of those teams that was on the rise. They finished the season really strong. If we were just looking at the finish of the season, you could even make an argument, I think, for Florida and Michigan to be in tier 2. I really do think you can make that argument. Michigan beating Ohio State, beating Alabama. You look at Florida and how they finished, beat Ole Miss late in the season. So there is that argument. And again, if you are just looking at the end of the season, I think Florida and Michigan definitely could be in tier number 2. BYU has an argument for tier number 2. There are some of these teams do have some arguments, but then you also have potential for like an Iowa State to be in tier 4. So I do think that it worked out pretty well here. And for example, Michigan and Florida, they're on the rise. So when we do our projected records, Florida and Michigan will move up to tier 2 because I think most people would say that those teams are going to be better. Now these other teams, will have to look at it and see, do they stay in tier 3? Do they move up? Do they move down? Again, that's something we'll look at here in a couple of weeks. So let's go to tier number 4 now. These are kind of a little bit above average teams. Texas A&M, Missouri, Minnesota, LSU, USC, Louisville, Syracuse, Georgia Tech, Colorado, Iowa. All of these teams showed potential at times to be pretty good teams, but then they also had games and times where they didn't look great. So these were very inconsistent teams. Again, showed potential, but also at times didn't look so great. And I think, these teams all pretty even. This seems kind of clear cut to me, these tiers. And now when we get into these bottom tiers, maybe I had a little bit of a harder time, but let's go ahead and move on to tier 5. This is, I guess, probably the biggest tier. These are basically just your average teams. So these are the teams that are not bad, but they're not really good. They're pretty good, I guess you could say. And you got a bunch of them: Arkansas, UCLA, Auburn, Nebraska, TCU, Washington, Boston College, Virginia Tech, Duke, Kansas State, Texas Tech, Pitt, Kansas, Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, Rutgers, and Baylor. So all of these teams, again, were pretty good. I think these are teams that you're looking at to potentially break out next year. Maybe some teams from this tier. Interesting that Pitt, they started so high. They definitely dropped a few tiers late in the season. You look at Baylor, they probably went up as the season went along. They were in a lower tier, I would say, earlier on. UCLA, a pretty good team, even though the record doesn't show it. I think they're at Auburn. Auburn lost a lot of close games, but you look at their close losses to Arkansas and Oklahoma. That's why they're all in the same tier, because they played close games against each other. Kansas State, probably the biggest disappointment on this list, I would say. Virginia Tech was a disappointment for a lot of people as well. So again, these teams are kind of teetering. Some of them are going to get, I think, a lot better next year, and maybe some of them drop off. Which ones will it be? We'll, of course, won't find out until next season. Let's go to tier number 6 now. We got Virginia, North Carolina, Cincinnati, Michigan State, Cal, West Virginia, NC State, Wisconsin, Utah, Northwestern, and Maryland. These teams slightly below average, I would say. All of them were disappointments. I guess Cincinnati, Virginia weren't expected to do a whole lot. Northwestern, but North Carolina was a disappointment. West Virginia was a disappointment. NC State, a big disappointment. Utah, a disappointment. Wisconsin, a disappointment. Maryland, a disappointment. So most of the teams in this tier were expected to be at least pretty good. And again, they were all just not very good. These were definitely some of the most disappointing teams this season. Let's go to tier number 7. We've got Arizona, Houston, UCF, Oklahoma State, Stanford, Wake Forest, and Kentucky. Talk about disappointments. More on this list, especially Oklahoma State. Arizona was a disappointment. UCF was a disappointment. Kentucky was a disappointment. All of these teams were pretty bad. Let's just be real. These teams were pretty bad this season. I would say they were awful. They at least had some decent moments during the season. Like, for example, Kentucky beat Ole Miss. I mean, that was a great win, but again, there just weren't, for the most part, these teams were not very good. These were just bad teams. And so then we go to our final tier, and I think there are only three teams that were just awful this season. And those 3 teams, Purdue, Florida State, and Mississippi State. These teams were just awful. They were terrible. Purdue was terrible in the Big Ten. Mississippi State, terrible in the SEC. Florida State, if you looked at them maybe halfway through the season, I think they were probably a tier 6 or 7 type team, but they just never got it going, and they finished horribly. This was one of the worst teams. Like, how do you go from 12-0 to 2-10? Like, how does that happen? I don't even know. And again, we could talk about that and talk about how they didn't have a foundation with the recruiting, the high school recruiting. I mean, there are reasons for it, but still, that big of a drop is just insane. These were, in my opinion, clearly the worst 3 teams in the Power 4. And I actually ran this list by a couple other people that follow college football closely. And I was kind of having them guess some of the tiers, like especially the top tier, the bottom tier. And they guessed these teams exactly right. So I think most people would agree with this list. I think, again, there are probably some teams that some people are going to want to move up or down a spot. But for the most part, I think this is a pretty solid list. I'm happy with it, and I think it came out pretty good. So would love to get your thoughts, though. What are the things that you would change? What do you disagree with? Or do you think this list was great? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.